Welcome and thanks for joining today's webinar, More Than a Slogan, New Perspectives on Cura Personalis. I'm Jim McCartan of Fordham University's Theology Department. I'm the chair of the National Seminar on Jesuit Higher Education, which publishes the magazine Conversations on Jesuit Higher Education, which is today's sponsor. And so I'm delighted to be here. Before I hand things off to our very capable moderator and panelists, I want to invite all the audience members out there to share your questions in the Q&A, which is at the bottom of your screen, of course. You can share your questions at any time. We'll get to a point in the webinar later on during the discussion portion when panelists will have a chance to respond. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce to you our moderator, Nancy Dalla Valle. Nancy is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Fairfield University, where she also serves as Special Assistant to the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, focusing on building community post-COVID. Nancy has served in various leadership roles at Fairfield, including as Vice President for Mission and Identity and as Chair of the Religious Studies Department. Her research has been in the areas of Trinitarian theology, as well as at the intersection of feminist thought and Catholic theology, and I wonder if Nancy might bring those things into the conversation today. I will let you know too that Nancy is an accomplished musician and earned an undergraduate degree in music, and perhaps that will come in too. Nancy, thanks for moderating today. I hand it off to you.
Thank you so much, Jim. And you've given me a list of to-dos that could take a while. We'll see what we can work in today. Thank you so much for joining us today. This webinar is asking a crucial question for Jesuit colleges and universities in an age when many schools, indeed most of our competitors, say that they too have a student-centered approach, and frankly, they do. How can we name what we do at Jesuit schools and what a Jesuit education brings to this idea? One powerful angle we bring to Cura Personalis at Jesuit schools is our commitment not only to today, but to a complex history and a prophetic future. I was struck with an illustration of this. After a travel ban was enacted by a new administration in January of 2017, lots of college presidents weighed in on how problematic this was. There was chaos at the airports. International people could not travel. The Washington Post did a survey of non-Catholic colleges and university statements, mostly secular schools, asking what they appealed to when they questioned that ban. And they gave answers that spoke to a very sort of broad but thin notion of inclusivity and tolerance and the need to welcome people. These are all good things. But then I went to the AJCU president's statements about that travel ban, and I asked what we said out of our Jesuit mission in the light of this ban. And the words that came up out of that were community, like our secular counterparts, but also arguments from history, arguments about justice, which is a forward-looking concept, arguments about commitment, which gives some energy to that forward-looking concept. And so I want to say that one thing we bring to this Cura Personalis is a much broader understanding of the human person. This is true for our students as well. They are not simply moments in a classroom or a residence hall. They come to us with life narratives, as well as hopes and dreams that pertain to the future, but are orienting them right now. That's who we're addressing. Indeed, this is true of our own lives as well, isn't it? History and hopes and dreams. So that too has to do with how we address the question of Cura Personalis. Our speakers today will fill out the current landscape for Cura Personalis, and we might want to ask how this whole person approach might more creatively shape our own approach as administrators and faculty, as frontline staff and teachers and leaders of this work. I'm joined today by three experts in this topic, people who are bringing very different perspectives to it. Julie O'Hare is director of St. Louis University's Prison Education Program, where she has been immersed in the work of facilitating whole person education for incarcerated people for the past 12 years. Julie is an alumna of St. Louis University and Boston College, and she is among a core group of leaders in the newly established Jesuit Prison Education Network, a coalition sponsored by the United Central Province and involving a coalition of Jesuit colleges and universities. Trung Pham is a priest in the Society of Jesus, an associate professor of fine arts at Seattle University. In addition to his studies in theological aesthetics and fine arts, he earned an undergraduate degree in chemical engineering. So several of us are singing out of several different songbooks. That's good. Trung works across various media, from painting to sculpture to video installations. Born in Vietnam, most of his work draws on his immigrant experience, and he describes his work as done in the tradition of in-between, between the finite and infinite, the visible and invisible, the human and the divine. Deborah Mooney is Vice President for Mission and Identity at Xavier University and a leader among mission officers. A licensed clinical psychologist, she is the author of 2 articles on the Conversations website that are relevant to today's program. One is on Cura Propria, or self-care, and the second, co-authored with Xavier's president, Colleen Hanich, and Jesuit Dan McDonald, on the academic, interpersonal, and institutional elements of care work on our campuses. These articles are available on the Conversations website. Gabriel Velez is Assistant Professor of Developmental Psychology at Marquette University's College of Education. His research focuses on adolescent identity development, and he is currently engaged with a team of scholars from Marquette, Fordham, and Loyola New Orleans on a multinational, longitudinal study of COVID-19's effect on student identity formation and the trajectory of their education. There comes that forward trajectory again. At the Conversations website, you can find an article co-authored with his Marquette colleagues on this ongoing work. These are our 4 presenters. They have very different lenses they are bringing to this work. We are really grateful that they've joined us today. I'm happy to invite Julie O'Hare to kick it off and offer us her reflections on Cura Personalis.
Thank you so much for being here today. So I've been asked to discuss what the higher education and prison context can teach us about how we ought to approach higher ed on a traditional campus in relation to development of the whole person. And I think the first part of that is for me to share the context of higher education in prison. So the prison education program at SLU offers an Associate of Arts degree to incarcerated men and to Missouri Department of Corrections employees. We offer all of our programming on site at our partner facility about an hour south of Missouri, an hour south of St. Louis. And we also offer a pre-college program to prepare people for future college experiences, and a robust arts and education program featuring speaker series, workshops. During the academic year, we have a member of the SLU community entering our partner facility almost every weekday. And we have had over 85 faculty members teach in the prison from SLU. So the physical context is that it is a maximum security prison, and we have to adapt to being in that space. We are guests of the Missouri Department of Corrections, and with that come some constraints. And then the context of our students' lives. Our incarcerated students are adults, all convicted of crimes that have resulted in them being incarcerated in a maximum security facility. In Missouri, men's prisons incarcerate men, trans women, and non-binary people. All of our students qualify as non-traditional due to their age and their living environment. In their current circumstances, all of our students are poor. And prior to their incarceration, most were poor or working class. Most have been victims of crime. People who are incarcerated are much more likely to have been victims of crime than people in the outside population. And all of our students have experienced the trauma of being separated from their families and their communities. For our staff students, there's a little bit of a different perspective, but still, I think one that is valuable to a traditional campus. In Missouri, prisons are located away from cities. So the areas that the prisons are in generally don't have a lot of political or economic capital. A lot of the staff students in our program are women over 40 who are going back to school to provide a good example because they want to set an example for their children and for their grandchildren. But a lot of the staff employees have experienced significant trauma in their lives. And a lot of that trauma has been at work. We do have correctional officers in the program, and people who work in that position have nationally, correctional officers have some of the highest rates of death by suicide. And there's a lot of psychological fallout from the job and not a lot of support. So clearly the context of the students' lives is very different than the context of a traditional college student at a Jesuit college or university. And to me, the way that this translates to what can this teach us about teaching on the main campus or building community on the main campus is the priority of having a radical acceptance for who our students are, what they bring to our community, what their lives have been prior to joining our community, and how can we respond to the situation in which they currently live. So something that anyone who's done teaching in prison can tell you, or has been involved in one of these programs. When you have new students at the prison, there is a lot of apprehension. And a lot of that apprehension is because our students don't have positive relationships with most institutions. And rightfully so, many of them are suspicious of outsiders coming in. And our way that so instead of just us focusing on delivering coursework, so much of what we do is about building a relationship of trust with our students. And clearly, I think, that is important on the traditional campus. And I think that most colleges and universities are very focused on having a trusting relationship with students. But I think focusing on building that relationship and not assuming that it is there is one of the places that we can start with development of the whole person, because truly students must be we think of our incarcerated students as companions in our work. They contribute significantly to a lot of our policies and procedures. We have a student advisory board. We actually have some alumni and currently incarcerated students serve in different capacities on our administrative team. And we do that as a way to establish a relationship where they know that we are prioritizing their needs and that we are valuing who they are and where they're coming from, even if the place that they're coming from is a place that is very difficult for them. We listen to our students when they tell us who they are and what their motivations for for obtaining higher education are. A lot of times people make assumptions that our students are trying to get a better job, and sometimes that's true. But mostly our students say that they are going to college because they want to be participating in a community and be a good example for their children. So, I want to just summarize or maybe wrap up by saying that I think Cura Personalis and development of the whole person, its relationship to higher ed and prison is we've learned to see students as truly partners and companions in the work in higher education and emphasize the importance of building trust in everything that we do, and that we can't assume that the trust exists. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to hearing more from other people and to answering questions.
Thank you so much, Julie. That was it's just really interesting to hear about that, and to hear about building trust, and that people are often doing this because they want to be a good example for their children. I think that's something we can share. Trung Pham, if you would please pick it up.
Good afternoon, everybody from California. I'm glad to be with you, to be with you and you coming from different part of the country. It's wonderful. I'm gonna do it in the angle of art. So I'm gonna share you a screen and then we'll go from there. How the arts can deepen and enrich the practice of Cura Personalis. My answer, the arts can deepen and expand the practice of Cura Personalis by allowing students to find their own voice, by exploring their place in the world with direct experience, and by allowing them to imagine what can be. So first, the arts can deepen the practice of Cura Personalis by allowing students to find their own voice and discover who they are. Art authenticates oneself, gives voice to the feelings that lie deep in one's heart. Sometimes the uncanny feelings are inexpressible in words. The arts harbor a safe place and allow the primordial expression to emerge and take shape. Arts make visible the invisible. This power of expression and creativity is unlocked and harnessed during the process of art making, which can be a process of healing, finding, and discovering. Cura Personalis, in a practical sense, means allowing one to get deeply in touch with their feelings, so to find their own voice and authenticate their identity. For example, I have a sculpting assignment for students to carve a chair from plaster. A student decided to carve a school chair from his memory to represent his painful experience in the school system when he was a young student. In his artist statement, he states, when he was a kid, he was always so confused by why he was in trouble. He always thought something was wrong with him. He wants to encapsulate this struggle in his carving assignment. He creates a standard school chair and a wall surrounding it. For him, the chair facing the corner represents a student in trouble, sitting in the corner of a room and being shamed. For this student, carving on plaster becomes a medium to express his deep, uncanny feelings that are still haunting him. The carving exercise allows him to face the unwanted experience, express sculpturally his own voice, and so to recreate himself for a different perspective. Second, when, quote, when the heart is touched by direct experience, the mind may be challenged to change. This inspirational quote, pronounced by the former general of the Society of Jesus, Father Peter Hen Kovenbach, has become a guiding principle for community engagement learning, a critical dimension of the UCORE curriculum at Seattle University. Art is not only the best vehicle for self-expression and self-definition, but also is a best practice for building a well-being of the community. Caring for the whole person is intricately linked with caring for the community. By caring for others, one is able to step outside of oneself, expand the horizon, and be able to put personal problems in perspective, which leads to healing of oneself. Through direct encounters and interactions with the real people and real issues, art students wield the tools of discernment, questioning, embodying, listening, and resolving. In other words, the arts can enrich the practice of Cura Personalis through community engagement. An example for this practice is the tiny home project in my 3D design class, where I asked my students to imagine a solution for the homelessness in Seattle. This issue has weighed on the city since 2015 and other places as well, other cities as well, and was exacerbated during the COVID pandemic. The city has made a great effort to resolve this problem by providing different solutions, such as converting old hotels into housing, building affordable houses, or funding resourceful programs, etc. But it still causes heartache for Seattleites. In the tiny home project, my students take field trip to a tiny home village in the neighborhood where they encounter the people without homes and learn about who they are and what they need. And from these interactions, students are asked to find a similar solution for these individuals. We simulate a similar situation at Seattle U by asking them to set up a tiny home village on top of a garage building where it is always empty. Using designing skills they learn in class, coupled with their imagination and creativity, they create a model and a proposal for this issue. The simulated audience is the president and the board of trustees of Seattle University. And here are some examples of the proposal and design. So this is just the image, but I wanna show you this. So this is the proposal they need to come up with. And this proposal, it's used thinking about using the container, shipping container, to convert that into a tiny home. And this is a garage on top of the parking garage on top of the structure. So this is a proposal they have to come up with. You have to come up with the cost and the location and design. But here is an interesting thing. This is what they use, and this is one example of the design. And I'm going to show you others as well. Here is another. They want to also create the whole village, and this is like from the parking structure. Or if you they can go off into extravagant kind of design with a lot more complicated structures. So this is a Shaper 3D design. Software program that on iPad, so they can use the fingers and the iPad Apple Pencil to create all these. Okay, so I'll go back to the third point. So we still have one more. Thirdly, the arts can expand the practice of Cura Personalis by allowing students to imagine what can be. Climate change is a real and threatening issue for our planet. In order to solve it, it needs the involvement of all disciplines and leadership from different fields. Laudato Si, the encyclical letter written by Pope Francis, named this resolution as integral ecology, which recognizes the interconnectedness of all aspects of the natural world, including the social, cultural, economic, and political dimensions. It emphasizes the need for an integrative and holistic approach to address the ecological crisis that the world is facing. What would a sculptor do in solving these ecological crises? Introducing the Habitats Project. Students in my Sculpture 2 class are asked to create a sculpture that cultivates a living habitat for local insects such as bees, birds, and ants. The effort is to imagine the environment that allows nature to be protected, restored, and thrive. This way of art making and displaying promotes the idea of art beyond museums and gallery walls. Art is for the common good, not just a commodity for commercial purposes. In short, Cura Personalis, in a larger perspective is caring for the common good and the common home. Conclusion. Cura Personalis, or caring for the whole person, means we pay attention to a person's heart, mind, and spirit. With integral connection and complexity of our changing world, the arts can play a role in deepening and expanding Cura Personalis by allowing students to get deeply in touch with themselves, connect with others, as well as reconnect with nature. In doing so, the arts allow them to find their own voices, explore their places in the world, and imagine what can be. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Father Pham. And you can see I'm scrambling for my mute button here. Some of us are still pretty analog, but we'll let some of the younger ones lead us into the future. That's good. Thank you for those beautiful slides. Your students' projects are just amazing. That's great. I'm just reminding everyone that if you have a question or even a comment for our panel and for the other people who are listening, we will have time for that at the end of this broadcast. While you're thinking it, you can just type it right into that Q&A panel and it'll save it, and we will be able to scroll through those and see if we can offer some at the end. So please feel free to do that. Our next speaker is my friend Deborah Mooney from Xavier. Deborah, please take it away.
Thank you. So in January, specifically January 19th, there was a tweet posted in Twitter. And it became a thread, day-long thread, but it started with Alexandra, and she posted this tweet. For the first time I can remember, I am seriously thinking of opting out of Lent. I have been overwhelmed with suffering and oppression, researching and writing my book on racial justice in the US the last 6 months, and I think I just need a break. That was viewed by 17,000 people. Back and forth now, tweets are being added and added and added, and we move on. And a little bit later, another woman posts, I'm writing a book on abuse and forgiveness and feeling the same. The book is penance enough. More and more posts come up. She's responding like, exactly. And then we have another woman post. I wrote for her alumni magazine about feeling similarly about Lent last year, and opted not to give up or add on a darn thing to my already depleted and demanding days. We go more and more posts, hours going by. Then Team Pajamas posts, one Lenten season, I decided to add an act of self-care every day. The original Alexandra posts, I need more self-care in my life, definitely. More and more back and forth, back and forth. Another person posts, do what you need to do for your own self-care. There's many different ways to do Lent, and I think that doing some self-care is one way to do it, so go for it. And Alexandra gives a thumbs up. That wasn't the end of that thread, but you get the idea. And you can probably assume that I share this because we certainly don't want this to be a common reaction to Cura Personalis, and the it being fatigue, burnout, even apathy at its worst. We had a woman here who was immersed in racial justice activism, and she was feeling depleted. And so many of the followers on Twitter were feeling the same way. They were feeling her pain. And we know there are many other people feeling the same way, and especially so these last 3 years with the COVID pandemic. We're being told we're leaving the pandemic, but social psychologists are telling us we're entering a psychological pandemic. As you heard in the introduction, I'm a mission officer currently. I'm also a licensed clinical psychologist. When I started at Xavier, I was a practicing psychologist and university wellness coordinator. So I look at this through the lens of mission and psychology. It's really my sweet spot. And I coined that term, cura propria. It is a Latin phrase for care for oneself. And I checked with the classicist and it matches just like cura personalis. But I would argue that Cura Personalis and Cura Propria are inextricably linked. The American Psychological Association conducts a survey every year of Americans, and it's called the Stress in America Survey. And the results most recently indicated that, or showed that, Americans are struggling with multiple stressors that are, quote, out of their personal control. That was the big thing this year, out of their personal control. 27% of us reported that most days we're so stressed we cannot function. 27%. The stressors that most impact us, racial climate at 62% of us said that. 66% say the political climate. 75% say violence and crime, and 83% say inflation. These numbers are even higher and stronger for young women being 18 to 34. So our students, our young faculty and staff. 62% of the women surveyed said that most days their stress is completely overwhelming. So in caring for others, or Cura Personalis, we need to reduce the effects of extreme stress that we are feeling and build resilience in ourselves, or Cura Propria. And I believe we need to do the same for educating our students for Cura Personalis, for service, for justice, for activism. And I think that it's easy for us to say, yes, of course. We all believe that you have to take care of yourself before you take care of others, or you can't give what you don't have. But I think that it's even more deeply cultural, a countercultural experience, in that when we think of the words relaxation, recreation, leisure, vacation, mindfulness, yoga even, our connotations are often unproductive, selfish, self-focused, self-indulgent, maybe even narcissistic. We make these connections and associations that make it difficult for self-care. For those of you that follow the New York Times, there was an article just this week, and it was titled, "How to Escape Faux Self-Care," faux being false. And it was about a psychiatrist who's written a book on, her focus is on, don't just buy things, almost the consumerism. Don't just buy things because the ads say they're good for you. Be a little bit more introspective and know what's important for your own self-care. But one of the things that she was quoted as saying is, we're living in a society that makes it really difficult for you to prioritize your mental health and your well-being. So we're constantly fighting upstream. So we need to focus on Cura Propria for ourselves. We need to educate our students for Cura Propria as part of Cura Personalis. I think it's important that we think of it as a virtue, and we call it a virtue. We call it our way of proceeding, our Ignatian way of proceeding. We call it a gift. We call it a value, so that it is valued and it is practiced. I think it's very difficult, maybe even impossible, to live the universal apostolic preferences of finding God, of caring for our home, of walking with the outcasted, and especially of journeying with youth in the creation of a hope-filled future, unless we are feeling well, whole, healthy, and wholesome. You heard Trung talk about the Laudato Si document of Pope Francis. And in it, he talks about the relationship of self-care and other care. And I'd like to just read a couple of the sentences from that same encyclical. And he addressed it by saying, Christian spirituality incorporates the value of relaxation and festivity. We tend to demean contemplative rest as something unproductive and unnecessary, but this is to do away with the very thing which is most important about work, its meaning. And he goes on to say about contemplative rest. It protects human action from becoming empty activism. It also prevents the unfettered greed and sense of isolation, which makes us seek personal gain to the detriment of all else. Rest opens our eyes to the larger picture and gives us renewed sensitivity to the rights of others, and motivates us to greater concern for nature and the poor. So I'm certainly not the first person to talk about the importance of self-care, and even the first person in our network to talk about it. But I do think that we need to be much more explicit about it and really, again, call it a value. We need to think of Cura Propria and Cura Personalis as intimately connected. They are, they should be viewed as separate entities or separate values, but they are inseparable.
Thank you so much, Deborah. That's very helpful, very useful. And finally, Gabriel Velez, if you would like to offer some reflections on Cura Personalis.
Thank you, Nancy. And thank you to all who are here and to these fellow panelists. I've got so many thoughts in my head. I feel like I'm distracted because it's been really wonderful to hear. And I want to get us quickly to the part where we get to engage with each other too, because I think that'll be really fascinating. What I want to share today in my reflection on Cura Personalis comes from some research that I've been doing with young people. So in the beginning, Nancy mentioned I'm a developmental psychologist. I was a teacher before that. I was a Jesuit volunteer. I went to a Jesuit high school. So I kind of have some of the Jesuit values and the ideas of Cura Personalis as part of my own formation. And now I'm very much interested in study young people's formation, which over the last number of years has really been shaped, as we all know, by the COVID-19 pandemic. And when we think about the pandemic, and sometimes, I think now we don't really want to think about it, right? We kind of we're putting it as a society sort of behind us. A lot of the things that we associate with the impacts on young people are negative, right? We see this in the media. We see the discussion of learning loss. We see the mental health crisis. And these things are real. And these are real impacts that these young people are carrying with them as they come to our Jesuit institutions of higher education. Right? We can't deny that. I know at Marquette, sort of anecdotally, we have a lot of conversations about some of the academic gaps and the ways that these students are arriving with skills that maybe students in past years had. We also have a lot of conversations that talked with student affairs folks about some of the conflict that's happening in things like residence halls that they feel is at just a different level because of the impacts on young people's social development. And I sort of start with this because I want to recognize and highlight that these impacts are real. And I think there's a lot of evidence that, yes, young people's social development, their academic development, their mental health and well-being was impacted. But I think when we think of Cura Personalis, we don't just want to bring this kind of negative lens and say, okay, how are we responding? How are we trying to deal with what's negative? But we also want to create a space in the care for the individual person to understand and think about how young people have been interpreting, responding, and how they're sort of carrying forth with them the impacts of the last number of years as they transition to college and now as they're in college. And so what I sort of mean by that, to flesh it out a little bit, is that, I think we have an opportunity to be focusing on the ways that they've been resilient, or at least not focusing, but offering that space for them to share resilience, coping, personal growth. And I think that that's a space that as a society, we are not really providing, but that Jesuit institutions are really uniquely set up to support. And to me, it's directly tied in with that Cura Personalis. So to kind of take a step back first to give a little bit of context. So in the beginning of the pandemic, I was sitting here in my home where I am now, and thinking about how my world had just been upended in many ways. And I was sort of struggling to process all that was going on. And based on a lot of the work I do with young people, it made me think, well, young people are in this really formative time. What does it mean to them? What's going on with them? And so I started a research project in 2020 that was focused on adolescents in high school. And I worked closely with the Jesuit Schools Network. So I ended up with a lot of students who were in high school and Jesuit high schools across really the North America broadly. And I did a couple surveys and interview work with some of those young people. And then the last number of years, I've been involved in a project that's here at Marquette. And as Nancy mentioned in the beginning, we now have partners at Fordham and at Loyola New Orleans, where we've been looking at young people as they transition to college. So as they come to college in their first year, and it's really all sort of focused around what is the pandemic meaning to them? What are the impacts that they describe it as having on them? And what are the lessons and takeaways that they're having from that? So rather than kind of taking a measure of a focus on they have these gaps in their reading and math skills, or we're having these social issues, or we're seeing higher rates of depression and anxiety, it's more about that kind of meaning making, the ways that they're experiencing and making sense of that. And one of the striking findings, and I will, 100% honestly admit that these samples are not necessarily representative and not every young person for sure. But one of the striking findings is how many of them talk about the experiences of growth that have come out of the depths of real despair and real challenge. And so they talk about the beginning of the pandemic, particularly in 2020, being a real deep struggle and being, things that they lost motivation for school, that they were, challenging their senses of identity, of the world, of its stability, the uncertainty that they had to deal with for a long stretch of time. But then they also talk about things that have come out of that for them that they feel like they're carrying forth with them. And, I'll share a couple of just quotes from some of the young people who have participated in our research. And these come from folks who are in this transition to college over the last couple years. And the first one comes from someone who was in their first year at Marquette in the fall of 2021. So if you think about that, they in the middle of their junior year is when the pandemic hit, and then their junior year and senior year were really deeply impacted by COVID-19. And this one person talked about, it made me almost very lazy when it came to schoolwork, just because we really did nothing at all year. I feel like I'm going into the future with no work ethic from the past 2 years, just because I haven't been able to do anything. And so they're talking about that struggle, right? And that recognition of this challenge. So it's not just about a gap in what they learned, it's about the ways that they were sort of deeply impacted in what they're struggling with. But the same person then went on to say that some of their takeaways included forming habits to help with depression and anxiety and stuff, like working out or talking to people or journaling or meditation. And I see sort of a connection to what was just being talked about. And I think, there it's saying, okay, there's this real struggle. They're still trying to figure out that academic part, but they also feel like there's this area where they're able to handle some of the challenges to their mental well-being in a different way and in a new way. I also sort of juxtapose that to some of what we heard from folks who were entering this past year. So their fall of 2022 was their first year on campus. And one of them talked about their senior year and said, so this would have been the 2020-2021 school year when they were senior in high school. Yeah, I was super stressed out from college applications, college decisions, all that stuff happening. But it was just so much easier to be eating lunch with your friends and going, oh my God, everything's so terrible. So there, and this person, in more of the context, was talking about the struggles that they had in the last couple of years of high school, but having a senior year, which was a little bit more normalized, and this is the 2021-2022 school year, they felt like just that return to normal and that return to connection with others was a little bit of a boost. And I share that because one of the key takeaways, I think, in relation to the Cura Personalis and these kind of impacts is that there's a real loss of sense of connection. And when we look at the roots of some of what young people were going through, both in what they describe in our literature and our research, and more broadly in the literature, is a real sense of disconnection from friends, from their schools, from their routines, right? From even the sense of stability and certainty in the broader world. And so, when I think of Cura Personalis in relation to this kind of response to what's happened over the last couple of years and supporting young people that are coming to our institutions, I think first of offering that space for the resilience, for the growth, for the coping, for them to share and make meaning out of that. And, not to force that on them, because some of them are not going to necessarily have that lens and maybe have really suffered in deep ways, but to give them that ability to kind of create that meaning out of it. And the second is doing that through a sense of connection, right? That human touch, like that last person described, like their senior year wasn't necessarily easier, but the being back in person and connecting with friends gave them real strength to carry through what was a difficult time. And so I think, and these institutions of higher education and Jesuit ones, we do Cura Personalis in many ways well, and that's been something we've been doing for years, but it might take some tweaking and refocusing in this current context. And this current context, even as we sort of move into a post-pandemic, into whatever kind of next stage of the pandemic, we're going to be having young people come to our institutions who are going to be carrying with them the deep impacts that were going on for them during 2020, 2021. And that's going to look different for different cohorts. It's different if you were 12 when things went entirely remote and there were quarantines and isolation, than if you were 16, than if you were 20. And we need to be thinking about how we're adapting and working through the ways that we support, that we connect young people together and with our institutions and with each other, and support this Cura Personalis more broadly. So with that, I'll wrap up and thank you. And I'm looking forward to some conversation with everyone.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. And, I hadn't even thought of that till you said it. I mean, I've been, I teach and I'm thinking that, okay, so this is the pandemic thing and some of the skills are not quite there, but I'm thinking that this is going to sort of pass, but no, I mean, there are going to be different impacts and it's different when you're 8. That's helpful to hear. The other thing is just for these students, they weren't not having years during the pandemic just because they didn't have their imagined years. This was their life. They authentically were alive during this time, and this is what they experienced. And there's a way in which we have to not just see this through a deficit lens. And I think you're also referring to that. Another thing I heard from everyone seemed to think, as you highlighted at the end, but came through in the others, that experience of community can be so healing and so whole making in all these different ways that we do this. I wonder, Julie, I was so struck by this in yours. Would you like to say anything about, you mentioned not only a sense of community among the incarcerated persons, but also among these people who have extremely stressful jobs in these prisons. What is that like, and how do they relate to and support one another? And is that of any help?
Yeah. So one of the interesting things I did, I tried to refrain from getting too into the weeds about how the program operates, but for our staff cohort, so our students, we operate on a cohort system. So students actually take all of their courses together. So imagine if your entire college experience was with the same students in every class. It's it has its challenges. It has a lot of benefits. That staff cohort has really helped me see, a type of community grow that is very supportive. So our staff cohort, our students take courses on an accelerated schedule. So one course lasts 9 weeks. They have a party after every final exam, and it's a potluck, and anyone who wants to go is invited. They set up informal tutoring before we actually had a formal tutoring network in place to support them. And they were also invested in each other's success. And that happens with our incarcerated students as well. But the amount of community support within the classroom, I also don't have as much experience teaching there on the traditional campus. But I can remember from my own college experience, I was never in a class that had that type of community support built in. Even with faculty members who intentionally worked on building community in the class, those faculty members were doing a great job, but this is student-led community building. And I think that's the part that is really powerful, is that these are students who know the challenges of being a person with a very stressful job, living in rural Missouri without access to a lot of resources, while also going to college, trying to support their family. I mean, it was really fascinating, but I think that student-built community is really kind of where I think the difference is.
Thank you. That's interesting. If anyone wants to jump in, just bounce in here. Trung, I was just going to ask, in terms of the student community, I mean, the people who do these art projects as a collaborative form a community, but it's forward, it's towards something. Do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, so they work together on that project with the homelessness, and also they get in touch with the real issue that we have around the city. So in a way, that movement, because this idea is from the Psalm, from the Isaiah, a prophet. I think that's right, maybe one of the prophets, and he said that if you have, everybody has our own wound. If you help other, your wound will be healed. That's just that line. So with that wisdom, this is a way to also get them step outside themselves and not get so consumed into one side. Also with the digital world, even though we use the technology, yes, that's another thing. They just get so much into it. so this is a way to also get them see a bigger picture, and that's might be a good things for our students these days.
No, that seems it. Yeah, Deborah, please.
Oh, I was struck by the theme kind of that went through the 4 presentations. Is it's always a good reminder at how important context is. I think, Julie, you brought that word up for us, but Cura Personalis takes a time and attention because it is about what is unique about each and every person. And Gabriel, you're really emphasizing that, right? That we can do stats and talk about effects, but the individual. And Trung, your example of a chair and the impact of an assignment of a chair and what it means individually. So Nancy, as you were introducing this and talking about what does it mean for our Jesuit universities, I think that idea of deeply understanding the individual within a unique context talks about the consciousness. You know, we think of, I was relating it actually to the Daily Examine, where we spend some time thinking about ourselves, but Cura Personalis is the same thing, only it's about the individual other person.
And it's exactly, Deborah, I'm thinking that part of we all have a core curriculum. You mentioned sort of the expansion of the mind of the human person, and that study. I have a question here. I have a ton of prompts over here, by the way. Our audience has been very active, which is great. They're asking about, in terms of Cura Personalis, doesn't our study of English and history and philosophy fill out that story for people and give them additional ways of entering into a sense of fullness that isn't simply this wafer thin, how can I feel better about myself? Another thing that people are bringing up here in the chat is this. They're asking, are we having problems at our university with the fact that it seems that so many things in life, and in some ways this is sort of, it sort of hit the higher education, things seem to be seen through a utilitarian lens. Do you ever find when you're trying to search for a whole or more holistic way to do this, that there are tensions at your schools over what we can value? That's a real question, people.
Yes, this is yes. Because our art program has been revised for the number of major, like we want to get more majors, and it's been okay. I'm gonna just share, like, oh my god, yeah, this is certainly when it comes down to the reality, we lose a director of a gallery or the curator of gallery, for example. We have to revise our program to get more students just for sustainability. So that's real. So between having, enough income and also how the art plays a role in this, I guess we try for the dean. For us as faculty, we want it to be like art. It's very important for the liberal arts education, also for the Jesuit tradition, pedagogy and all these, but when it gets to the real question of money, then they make the decision, and usually it hurt us. Okay.
There's some very hard sort of incommensurable goods banging up against each other, and that's made it difficult. Another audience member raises a question that I certainly have observed about, we spoke of the value of community, yet it's often difficult to engage people in community, particularly post-pandemic. My own gut reflection to anything that happens at 7:30 at night is, please, I can do kind of one of those a week, but not so many anymore. So it has changed. Can you speak a little bit about that and how that is it's impacting our ability to be pulled into community? Are there any strategies at your schools, I know there are some at ours, that are seeking to counteract those, whether with students or faculty? I am just looking for ideas here, people. We have 3 minutes, by the way.
Nancy, I'll be real quick. I have a couple
Please.
thoughts there, and I know there are a bunch of interrelated questions. One of the things really quickly I just think is I think of levels with some of this, right? And so you can think of like institutionally Cura Personalis and maybe some of the challenges, and finances can come in there. You think at the level of a program, a department, an office, right? And those challenges, and then you can think kind of like interpersonally with like the people I interact with. And in that space, we have a lot of control, I think, in sort of the work that we're doing. And what was discussed before is maybe thinking more about institutionally some of these financial questions that can come into play, and those are real, and those are all interconnected too. Those are not isolated layers, right? So I think there's a final question there that I think speaks to this, where when you're not necessarily feeling like you're receiving the Cura Personalis from the institution from above, it can be even more challenging to give that yourself. But to your point, I think about concrete tips and ideas. I don't necessarily have an answer to that, but what I will say is I think we need to give ourselves time to rebuild social connection and fabric. And to me, it's going to be a process, and I think of Cura Personalis that way too. It's not okay, like we need to do this and we're going to all of a sudden bring people back together and connect them, right? Building connections, social bonds, trust that was talked about before, those are engaged processes. And I think if we think about the last number of years as sort of a collective trauma, it's going to take time, it's going to take time to rebuild that connection. And we need to be thoughtful about these sorts of challenges that are coming from all places. It's not going to happen just organically, but we also need to give ourselves a little bit of that space to rebuild from what happened.
Yeah, I like your tone about this. It's going to, speaking of time, however, I was wrong. We do have till 4:15, so we have some time. So let me just, one thing I wanted to mention about that. So at our own school at Fairfield University, I just started a thing called First Thursdays. On the first Thursday of the month in the College of Arts and Sciences, I bake brownies. I bring little pieces of cheese on a plate. Perhaps some beverages are supplied by a higher power that just appear. I don't know where they come from. And we just invite the faculty and staff to come together and be together. And it's, it hasn't been easy to get people to come, but they do. They like it when they do come. They say, I can't come this time, but please keep doing this. And so not just our students, but it has been hard to get our faculty, out and engaged with one another. And I wondered if anyone had any other strategies for this. Part of the issue there, of course, is we have new young faculty who have joined us, right? And how are they being brought into our communities? Any reflections on any of that?
I would underscore what Gabriel emphasized, is that it took time for us to get to where we are, and it's going to take some time to unravel. We've been for a couple of years told we shouldn't be near other people, and so it's going to take a while. But I think natural groups are always helpful. So when Julie talks about a group of people that are all working for something, that they've come together, and that maybe we need to think of intact groups a little bit more often, rather than maybe necessarily bringing people together. What about the people that are already together? What might we do to help deepen that? Circle back to the idea about Cura Personalis and tension, and we can think of that as a tension of Cura Apostolica too. We can keep it in a Cura too, right? We have care for our institution and care for our individuals. All the cares do have a little.
I have another question from our audience here. I'll read. Students sometimes conflate universal flexibility and Cura Personalis. Coming out of the pandemic, we've been struggling to establish boundaries and deadlines again, but students will cite Cura Personalis. So they listen, that's good, as justification for the need for endless flexibility. How do we articulate that teaching students professional responsibilities does in actuality fit into our core mission, and perhaps is an aspect of Cura Personalis as well? Any successful teachers out there? Trung, you're smiling. You're in art. People in art are always endlessly flexible, aren't they? Because it's creative. You just got to wait till the muse strikes. Yeah.
No, they need to work. I have to extend it to the midnight of that day instead of the thing. Certainly, the flexibility after the pandemic, with teachers, we kind of have a different perspective. And also, I have also problem with attendance. That's another issue. Or late coming. They're not used to be before, where they come on time and get ready. Now they just gradually come, and I remind them so many times, and tell them, and also have a grade according to their time when they come. But then it's just this nature of this. So it's very challenging. So number one, it's very challenging how to do this well. Firm deadline, extend a bit more, but then firm at a certain point. There's no other way around. So that's how we slowly get back to what before the pandemic.
My initial thoughts in this area actually didn't go to students, but it went to a lot of the faculty that I work with. So one of the things, there's a lot of kind of administrative work that we have to do to get our faculty to be able to go into the prison. And a lot of, faculty sometimes are very used to flexible deadlines. And I have to remind them, like, I am not talking to you as a university administrator. I'm talking to you from the prison. This is a prison. So this deadline is a deadline. And one of the things that, I've been trying to cultivate is about how to be a good program community member. And that means responding to everyone and all of the needs of the program. And again, that's hard because I also want to respond to my own needs. But, there's things that we have to do that are part of participating in a community. And I think that means interacting with people with a high level of professional responsibility. I am not an expert on how to translate this into students. But the perspective of, yes, you are a student and you have to protect yourself, but you are a part of a larger community. Maybe that is a perspective. Because your actions don't just exist out in the world on your own. They, exist in a much larger ecosystem.
Yeah. Gabriel, so if you would, in terms of the work that you've done, analyzing how people are re-entering, I mean, we didn't go anywhere. It happened. That was our world with the pandemic. Are there ways in which, you spoke of resilience, that some of these, that actually the experience of doing of doing things in a different way and then coming back to a different way can be part of Cura Personalis?
Yeah, I think, so I don't necessarily have any, to be honest, like empirical support for this per se, but I do think that, when you allow space or you can emphasize that element of like resilience or coping, you're also allowing students not to fall into these narratives and discourses that are so much about just the negative impacts, right? And it's such a tough line to walk. And that's what I was trying to kind of lay out before, where you're not denying, these students who miss class and say, I was feeling, incredibly anxious, I couldn't come to class, or, talk about being overwhelmed and so they can't get the assignment in on time. But I think if we're shifting narratives and creating space where it's about, how did we all come through this? What's our strength? And so that's a Cura Personalis that's not just kind of like this sort of consistent across time. It's a specific reflection of sort of growth or rebounding or response to a difficult time. I think we can maybe, promote a sense of resilience and strength in young people. And when I read these sort of news articles, I just become, I sort of enter into the mindset of young people, and some that I've talked to, where they don't feel like there's the opportunity. They feel like they have to sort of just to some degree maybe wallow in the challenge that they're facing personally or the challenge they faced. And that has to kind of come to define them, because that's the message that's really being emphasized at a broader level. And some of these questions, I think, that I'm seeing and even thinking about this, to me also deals with that difficult dynamic of when you have something happening in society, how do we push back on that a little bit? And Deborah spoke a little bit to that, where Cura Personalis maybe, needs to be framed as sort of countercultural. in a sense. And I think it comes into play here where we maybe frame it as, that Cura Personalis in this response to sort of the pandemic is about showing our resilience, showing our strength, showing how we learned and grew. And that is, I think, in some ways counter to what society is sort of emphasizing and pushing right now.
Do you think there's a social media feedback loop a little bit? I've been reading about how, in some ways that, this kind of the observations about ongoing stress and trauma have led to a loop of stress and trauma. Maybe you can nuance that, though. Maybe I'm reading that wrong. What were you thinking?
Yeah, I certainly think there's good evidence that that's a factor. And some of the mental health concerns we're seeing out of the pandemic, I mean, those were there before, right? There's growing mental health concerns for young people before. And there's some evidence that some of that, is maybe tied to things like social media and that has a lot of dynamics. I think it's easy to vilify, to sort of make social media the be all and end all evil. And I think that's kind of what you're speaking to, and I think we need to think about, again, when I think of those levels, I think of the ways that we need to think about how we, with the students we work with our colleagues, interpersonally maybe can push back and combat some of that.
Yeah. Other thoughts about this? I certainly have. Someone said, here's a question for Deb. I'm reading off my sheet here. How can we successfully practice Cura Personalis for students when in all sorts of ways, big and small, we may not model it in our workplace? I just read the news here, people.
Yeah. Well, I'm assuming that is referring to some of the tensions of the general curas. But it's interesting. This reminds me actually of a study that was done on our own campus. And in general, people had a concern about supervisors or administrators, but they thought that their own supervisor or administrator was great. It was really kind of interesting. Then people kind of, when they saw the results, kind of chuckled that the generic university administrators are awful, but mine is very good. And so I guess I go back to the individual. What is it we have control over? How is it we can be good within our own network?
I think that's very true in terms of, right. And, faculty are always saying that administrators are all uniformly bad, except for, I like my dean, my dean works with me, but that's because this person. And that gets back to that. If we are not, trying to create community together and at least trying physically to be in the same place every once in a while, we may lose some of that sense for who actually is around us. I mean, when the only time we see them is in emails or on Zoom, I think that can be a concern.
Yeah.
Wow. Someone asked how we can do justice to the depth and breadth of Cura Personalis while also respecting the location, dignity, and beliefs of the folks with whom we co-create a Cura Personalis space. I was reading that as, are we sometimes too prescriptive about what we expect to be the result of this particular framework?
That's a tough one. But what just popped into my mind was, and I don't know if this is related, but maybe my fellow panelists can help me out here. But Pope Francis's notion of a culture of encounter. When you're with someone that's different, you appreciate both your oneness and your uniqueness.
I think that's true. Yeah.
So I'm wondering about that.
I would just suggest that, as we're coming near the end of our time here, that culture of encounter requires a few skills. That great Ignatian presupposition that we're going to think the best and try to put the best interpretation on the comments of the other person that opens the exercise. I think that we have to practice, though, encountering the other in order to do so, successfully, to create these communities of care. It's not going to be a one-off walking out of this pandemic, I think. It's going to be a place where we're going to have to practice engaging with other people, particularly if we want to continue to have universities that welcome diverse people, diverse experiences, diverse perspectives. That's not something that can just be willed. I think that does have to be sort of built, created, cultivated over time. At least that's what I'm suggesting here. Any other last observations from my friends here?
Yeah, so the
Please.
caring is a universal value. So it doesn't have to be limited to the culture and political view or other viewpoint. So at a certain point, we have a universal things, and we also have uniqueness. So then, I guess to answer that question, because this is the great things that we do, so we don't have to worry about that personal lens, unless we only think about our own ethnic group, and that's maybe the question. So maybe we have to rise above a bit, all. Maybe the logical viewpoint can help, because this is all, not just a particular group.
Right, right. In fact, that person started with a broader theological perspective. So I think that does provide a way for us to join together. Anyone else? Last thoughts? What will be your next move, Gabriel, while you're looking at this and trying to chart a way forward for us?
That's a great question. I would say personally, I'm trying to engage in a lot of work around restorative justice in higher education spaces. So I've done some research in the K through 12, but part of this is because I think restorative practices, we see them as a response to behavior, discipline, those kind of issues. But I think they also offer a lot of opportunities for healing and connection and building that. And so that's kind of where I'm thinking of doing some work at Marquette right now and around the Milwaukee area. And I'll just make a little plug for the University of San Diego that has a really wonderful center for anyone out there who's interested in sort of delving into some training and background on that topic.
That's wonderful. And now, while we're at the advertising part of the program, I'm going to say thank you to everyone. Thank you, Gabriel Velez, Julie O'Hare, Trug Pham, and Deborah Mooney. Thank you very much, Jim McCartan, for pulling us together with Conversations Magazine for this experience of discussing Cura Personalis. Thanks, everyone.